Hello. This is Movie Thoughts. My name is John Hastings. This is my sloppily recorded and now sloppily filmed, hopefully intermittently insightful podcast about movies and my thinking about movies. We have a fan page on Facebook, Movie Thoughts Podcast. We've got this YouTube channel under Forager23. I have reviews that I post on Letterboxd under the username Forager23. And then we have the podcast itself on Anchor, and it's on Apple Podcasts and other places too. It's on Spotify, so that's where you can see or hear this. And this is the 26th episode. I've been trying to do an episode a week, so that puts me about doing this for about half a year. So that's good. I don't know it's half a year of good content, but I've tried to put out something every week. Today's episode is going to be about, I'm going to talk about the Oscars, and I actually had planned, I started to make notes for, think about doing an episode about the Oscars earlier in the year around the actual time of the Oscars, just my thoughts about the Oscars and some of the Oscar nominated movies of the year. And I ended up just kind of not really not really getting around to it, and then the Oscars happened, and I figured, well, that was kind of I'm gonna not do it there as I missed my opportunity. But then, in retrospect, I'm not really a topical. This is not like a topical movie podcast. I'm not talking about new releases, or not kind of keeping up with the news really. So I thought it was more or less not a big loss to that everyone was spared my thoughts of on the Oscars this year. I don't think I pay enough attention to really do that type of conversation justice. But what I do like to talk about, and what my thing is here, is kind of nitpicking about these types of arguments that come up again and again when people talk about movies, especially on the internet. So arguments of the type I've seen since the beginning of talking about movies on the internet, back in message boards and Usenet back in the early 90s. Certain arguments kind of come up again and again, like that. So my episodes on, like, people who are repeating themselves, is kind of, those always fall into the same pattern. And these kind of who's better than, or what's the greatest decade for movies, all these arguments kind of come up again and again. And I usually find that on the internet, at least, they don't necessarily lead to much real discussion. They just kind of stall out. And so the topic today is kind of this idea of undeserved Oscar winners as a topic, and can we go beyond the normal way that topic just kind of stalls out on the internet, and kind of get to putting some more context into it? Can we get somewhere a little bit more interesting than just I'm mad that this movie I really love didn't win some award? Okay, that's fine. Can we get beyond that? Let's see. So first, though, I do want to kind of lay out my thinking about the Oscars, and what, for me, the Oscars mean. And so I'll start by saying there are a lot of reasonable complaints you can make about the Oscars, and I think I would probably agree with all of them. Maybe. I mean, I can't. There's just so many things you can kind of pick at the Oscars for, which I think are accurate, or have a valid point to it. Um, you know, I don't think the Best Picture Oscar has ever gone to the Best Picture in a given year. So straight up, I mean, and that's not a I mean, obviously that's not a controversial thing to say. Like most, I think you get to a certain level of being a serious movie fan, and you realize, like, they have no connection whatsoever, in some sense, or not no connection, but very little connection. Even if we just limit to, like, the best American prestige picture of the type that sometimes wins Oscars, those usually aren't even the ones kind of winning the best picture. I think that a lot of times lousy movies, more often just kind of boring or safe movies, are the ones that are being nominated and winning awards. A kind of more kind of system level thinking too is that there's whole kind of species of movies, or kind of classes and genres of movies, that just are not even considered being, like, Oscar worthy. And I think that a lot of those are actually really worthwhile or interesting or even great filmmaking. So, no, I mean, I think Resident Evil Retribution is at least as good, if not better, than most of the Oscar winners of the last 10 years at least. But not only is no one in the Academy is going to nominate a Resident Evil movie or kind of consider a Resident Evil movie as being worthy of their attention. They're not even going to really consider other movies in that kind of same ballpark that are more reputable, that are, so that kind of a whole that whole kind of a there's a whole genres, kind of, we can think of like horror and action adventure, and there's some edge cases where you can kind of say like, what about The Shape of Water or whatever. And there's certainly cases where some genre pictures can kind of get up there, but in general, those don't make up like the core of what it means to be like an Oscar movie. Uh, and then, but then, they don't like the Resident Evil stuff. They don't even consider that. But they're also really not going to nominate like a Bruno Dumont movie either to win Best Picture. So they're not like, uh, again, this is like a middle brow thing. They're gonna the high and the low is going to be excluded from the Oscars. They go for the safe choices I mentioned. They are parochial, so really Hollywood centric. Even sticking to America, they're not friendly towards independent cinema or regional independent cinema. So it's whole worlds of filmmaking that doesn't play into the Oscars. And then another big criticism, it's really just a marketing ploy. This is a way for Hollywood to congratulate itself and advertise for itself, and this is like already a huge industry, and it's very kind of can get very self-righteous, and they kind of can get into this idea that what they're doing is really super important, and you can say like, no, you're just kind of making middle brow kind of goofy middle brow movies that aren't really that people aren't going to remember in 10 years. It's not that great. um, Having said that, so those are all the, and you can come up with more negative things. I probably agree with a lot of those too. Having said that, if you do move away from focusing on just the winners or even just the Best Picture category, and you sort of start to look at all the movies nominated in all the different categories, I think, to be fair, you do get a good bunch of movies. I think that's more interesting than looking at just the winners. You do get a little bit, it's a little bit broader. There's more surprises. Um, and even though it's still a limited pool, but even though it's a limited pool, I think there is something nice about, and even though there's this ulterior motives of advertising for themselves and marketing and self-congratulations, all of which is true, there is still the sense that this is a contest about who made the best work of art, and historically, a lot of people have cared about this. A lot of people are invested in this idea of which, this is as if it is sort of the worth of the movie as art does come into play in some way in these valuations. And you can kind of roll your eyes or kind of just think the idea of a contest about art is goofy. And again, I think that's a reasonable response. But I think it's kind of, especially in today's day and age, I think it's kind of nice. I think it's kind of cool that even though the politics come into play, and even though Hollywood trying to project this image of itself that it wants to project, to kind of say like, oh, we're performing some type of public service. This isn't just superficial. But I still think, there is, you can dig at it. It might not be right there. It might be obscured or pushed aside by other competing values. But this idea that like making the better movie is what we're there to celebrate. I think that never gets completely banished from people's consideration about these awards and about the meaning of the awards. And so those are all that's kind of what I kind of say about it. I think lots of criticism, but I think at its heart, I think it's kind of cool. I think it's kind of nice. I don't want to get too, I can't get this. I don't quite subscribe to this idea that just kind of like completely laughing at it or completely pushing it aside. I think it's kind of cool. And then, personally, I'll talk back. The Oscars played a big role for me in getting interested in movies and movies as art, and not. And again, this is not really so much from the winners or even from the Best Picture category, but just from kind of seeing clips of the nominees in all the different categories. You kind of got exposed to seeing movies as a young person, like when I was in my early teens, movies that I wouldn't necessarily have been turned on to if not for that. And I still remember from a big impression of the February 1992 Oscars, I remember all the clips from Barton Fink which were for like production design. I think mostly it wasn't like Barton Fink was, I think, a Best Picture nominee, but that really stuck with me, and you know, that experience. So I value the Oscars and the Oscar broadcast for that role it had for me. I mean, I wonder if they do still play that role at all, or whatever. But I have some loyalty to Oscars for that. So, having said, you know, all those criticisms, and then kind of trying to defend against some of the criticisms, and then some of my personal story, my personal Oscar story of, I used to, you know, when I was 14, I thought they were really cool. Uh, Learned about Barton Fink that way. Great. Um, you know, I will admit now, I will then say now is like, even, you know, it's all sort of theoretical. Practically, I don't actually really keep up with the Oscars. Have never like actually tried to like, oh, I'm gonna watch every nominee this year. It's been many years since I've watched an Oscars broadcast, even a bit of one. Maybe going on 20 years, although you know, between 15 and 20 years since I've seen any type of Oscars thing. Uh, you know, so I could say like, well, I like them, but not to the extent I'm actually gonna like watch them or change my movie watching habits because of them. And so like last year actually was sort of an example where I by accident I watched a couple of the nominees, but I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I expected Joker to be nominated, and I didn't even necessarily expect Once Upon a Time in Hollywood to be nominated. um, so that was sort of accidental that I had seen two of the nominees prior to the Oscars coming out. But and oh, and I guess this reminds me of another way I do benefit from the Oscars is I did get to see Pain and Glory, which was my favorite movie of last year, only because Banderas was nominated for an Oscar, and they brought it back to my little art house theater in my town, so I got to see it in the movies because of that. And it was the last movie I think I saw in a theater before they all closed down. Um, but even in the case of you know, me getting to see Pain and Glory, and it was there because Banderas was nominated. I didn't want to see it because Banderas was nominated. That had no concern. I just wanted to see a new Almodovar movie on the big screen, which is probably the best way to watch his movies. And just incidentally, obviously, like, you know, about that performance in Pain and Glory. What's striking is that like it's such a thoughtful performance and so muted and low key, and so much is kind of happening in a very uh, you know, on a very subtle register, that I'm really surprised that it was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Performance, which are usually there to celebrate kind of big obvious performances. Even if they're great performances, they tend to be big obvious great ones. And I guess the trick, or like what makes it sort of a nomination worthy, is that Banderas is supposed to be a movie star, so the idea that he's giving this subtle performance is like is noteworthy or something. I guess, I don't know. Anyways, it's a great performance, and I think the was the best performance that was nominated of what I saw. Okay, so anyways, in theory, you know, so to sum up, in theory, I support them. In practice, I have no interest in watching them. I don't care about who wins or loses. I am happy when something I like wins, and it's probably mostly irrational. It's very tribalist, like, oh, my side, yay. But maybe there's some reason is like you think that if a movie you like wins or is nominated, that might lead downstream to more movies you like of that type, or movies of that type, or by that director or actor you like getting made. I don't know how much that plays out. Usually, people learn the wrong lessons. So you know, when you know, they don't necessarily learn a good lesson from a great movie winning awards. They usually learn the wrong lesson and try to chase awards by doing something only superficially related to like what that first movie was doing, if that makes sense. Um, anyway, so I bring all this up to say that you know, all of that was sort of an introduction. The first like 15 minutes of this episode have just kind of been to introduce, to get us here. I think that you know, I get why serious film buffs find themselves in this situation where, on the one hand, they just want to poo-poo the Oscars totally, or just kind of look down at them and see it as this thing that they're kind of above. And I get why they get caught up in these discussions about who should have won or what was unfairly overlooked. I mean, first of all, none of us are consistent in everything, and also like I said, I think people probably do have more mixed feelings about the Oscars than they necessarily let on or are able to like express in the context of some of these internet discussions. So let's get to the topic of the actual show now, like which is this idea of the undeserved Oscars, movies that were robbed of Oscars. Again, this is, I've mentioned this before on on the podcast. Like this is one of these sports type discussions that maybe just doesn't, maybe we can say like sports type discussions don't belong at all. They happen all the time on the internet, so I think we should need to address them in some way. I think they do become interesting if we move beyond that initial judgment. So if you just some kind of say like, "Oh, Citizen Kane deserved the Oscar," okay, so like what next? Like let's see where we can go with this discussion. Besides, like I like Citizen Kane better than How Green Was My Valley, which doesn't get us very far. Um, we want to look at some of the context that these decisions were made in, and want to look at some of the values that we have when we are making these arguments that one deserved something that they didn't. One deserved something and the other one didn't. So let's start then. Let's get back to this the classic "How Green Was My Valley" robbing Citizen Kane's Oscar, and like I say, this was this all of this has been inspired by seeing this recent conversation on this Facebook group for egghead movie buffs talking about movies. But this is a discussion that's come up for years and years, so it's not like new to this. It's not like this guy in this group was like, "Aha! I've found something that's inconsistent in film history," or "Well, look at this great scandal." It was brought up in the context of like, "Hey, this is a topic people have talked about a lot. What are your opinions of it now?" So. Anyway, this is a topic. This particular matchup, Citizen Kane versus How Green Was My Valley, has been around for a while. So the first thing I'll say is that my sense of it, and someone who knows more about some of the specifics of the film history can correct me or may correct me, but it's really just it is mainly a political choice that the Oscar voters at that time were making. You know Rather than like, oh, this is a better movie necessarily. So as I said, before, this idea that politics play a part in all of this, it's not just about the best movie. Certainly we can see this is a case where politics played a part. First of all, like people not wanting to ruffle William Randolph Hearst's feathers and give Citizen Kane awards. And then also, John Ford is Hollywood, and at that time, for his whole career, Orson Welles was an outsider, and the idea of giving it to this, this guy this Johnny come lately, this wunderkind from another domain, kind of theater, and kind of coming in and making this and showing that he could make a better movie than everyone in Hollywood. So, kind of giving the award to John Ford's movie, How Green Was My Valley, in a way is political in that sense too. It's saying, no, the Oscars are about us, not him. He's not part of us. So that's some of the context behind it. What I would then say though is, if you remove Citizen Kane from the picture and pretend Citizen Kane kind of wasn't made that year, and you just look at How Green Was My Valley as winning the Best Picture Oscar that year, then it's somewhat makes it a little bit, I think, thorny or more interesting, because How Green Was My Valley is probably the best movie ever to win a Best Picture Oscar, and other people can come up with other nominations for that title, but for me, this is just like a heartbreakingly beautiful movie, one of John Ford's greatest movies. It's I think just quite amazing. I think even if we say it's certainly in like the top five of the best movies ever nominated, or who have ever won the Best Picture Oscar. And I think it's maybe you could make a pretty good case. Like let's take Citizen Kane aside, that it is the best movie of the year. It seems to be one of the times that the Oscars actually come closest to giving the Best Picture award to what might actually be the best picture of the year, even like looking at international cinema. So, but then you've got Citizen Kane, which is no slouch. Citizen Kane is pretty great. It is often considered one of the greatest movie of all time. And I do think it's a better choice for greatest movie of all time than How Green Was My Valley, even though I can't really fault the people kind of think about it. If, to a certain extent, think about it. I can't fault Hollywood for choosing How Green Was My Valley over Citizen Kane. A lot of its greatness has to do with its historical importance and kind of comes about in some ways in retrospect. So, so I do think it's a little bit thorny issue. I think this idea that Citizen Kane was robbed or that How Green Was My Valley didn't deserve to win is a little unfair to How Green Was My Valley, which is a great movie, and I think in any other year wouldn't be controversial at all. I mean, you can kind of and if Citizen Kane had to lose to something, like at least it lost to a great movie. It didn't lose to it didn't lose. I don't want to insult fans of other things, but it didn't like lose to like a terror. It didn't lose to like something pretty terrible. Lost a pretty good movie. Okay, so some other, so that's the what I get out of that matchup or that complaint. Other people might have other thoughts. Some other, you know, other places where people have kind of said like, ah, this is undeserved or not deserved. Going My Way, which won, beating out Double Indemnity, which was also nominated. People have I've seen that as people bringing that up as a as another one of these unfairly, a Double Indemnity was robbed. I actually kind of like Going My Way better than Double Indemnity, although I think they're both great movies. I wouldn't kind of argue too strenuously against Double Indemnity in that matchup. But I do think Going My Way is a pretty great movie. It is, again, a win that doesn't seem so much related to people necessarily thinking that it's so much better than Double Indemnity. It does seem more, again, political, people wanting a more upbeat movie in the context of, 1944 with a lot of bad things going on. So saying like, oh, let's celebrate this kind of nice, warm-hearted, funny movie rather than this very cynical movie that looks at really the negative side of human nature. I kind of I sympathize with wanting to maybe celebrate something a little lighter in that context, and I also kind of get the point of people who say like, no, this is when we should be kind of being more realistic about human nature. Anyway, I kind of like it. If you move on, that year, if you move past the movies that were not nominated for Best Picture, I think you get some big greater movies than both of them, like Meet Me in St. Louis or Hail the Conquering Hero. And it's a little bit weirder for me to see. I really like Going My Way, but that year I think Leo McCarey winning for Best Director over Preminger and Hitchcock is maybe pushing things a little bit, but again, I think this is like a, mostly again a political choice of having to do with like wanting an upbeat movie versus these more negative visions of the world. And again, I think it's a really terrific movie. I know some people don't like it. I've read some pretty good arguments against Going My Way, but I think it's a pretty nice movie. So another big one that comes up with these like, oh, didn't deserve it is The Greatest Show on Earth, which people say is one of the worst Best Picture Oscar winners. It often gets close to the top of the list for worst Best Picture winners. And everyone kind of acknowledges that it's really just an award given to celebrate Cecil B. DeMille's whole career. And it beat High Noon, which was also nominated, and it beat The Quiet Man, which was also nominated. I don't much like High Noon. I think it's one of the more overrated classic movies in the American canon, and I do like The Quiet Man quite a bit. I think you cannot overrate The Quiet Man. Other movies from that year that it beat that weren't even nominated are Singing in the Rain, which is, I would agree with the general consensus that it's one of the great Hollywood movies of all time. It beat The Bad and the Beautiful, or Bad and the Beautiful wasn't even nominated, which is a great movie. And then it also beat some great movies that would not have ever been nominated. I mean, you could imagine The Bad and the Beautiful being nominated, but The Lusty Men by Nicholas Ray, one of the great American movies of all time, didn't really have a chance to get nominated. Not really a movie that was respected in its time. And then Rancho Notorious by Fritz Lang. Again, Fritz Lang on the sort of the downside of his career, making genre pictures that people weren't taking that seriously at the time. But those are both really great movies. So you come out with, I think most people can look at that the greatest show on earth is like not is really a great example, one of the best examples of clear cut examples of, this movie didn't deserve to win an Oscar, and yet, well, I mean, first of all, I'll say I actually like it. I like the old late creaky DeMille style, but even if you don't like it, I think it's reasonable to say I think it's okay to give an award to celebrate the whole career, and to kind of, we understand that it's not there just for this specific movie, but it's there to celebrate the whole career. Like, you kind of miss the boat on some other ones and you make it up to him. That seems like a fair human thing to do. I don't think it's really something to get too upset about. Certainly the reputations of, the reputations of like High Noon and The Quiet Man have not suffered for not winning the Best Picture Oscar. I think we can be okay with that. So I kind of am glad the greatest show on earth won. Maybe like I say, I like it. Maybe the attention drawn to it with people being curious will get them interested in Late DeMille. Maybe they'll see it and be completely turned off because it is kind of creaky. But anyway, I can't get too upset about that one. So moving to some more recent ones, which people might have more stronger feelings about just because they lived through it or more recent. So Crash winning over Brokeback Mountain is considered a great travesty, and it's kind of an interesting to step back as it's sort of kind of Hollywood trying to you can see that Crash versus Brokeback Mountain thing as Hollywood, maybe people would argue it's choosing the safer choice by choosing Crash, which is this movie about social justice and racism, versus Brokeback Mountain, which had which has the LBGT themes in it. I don't know that, so you can see like Hollywood maybe trying to, were they being safer, or does Hollywood just like movies about social justice and racism, and that's kind of really, it seems to me Crash is really in the mainstream of the type of movies Hollywood likes to promote about itself making. 2005 wasn't really a great year for movies as far as I can tell. You know, all of the nominees that year seemed kind of weak to me, and I think the Terrence Malick's The New World is the best movie from that year that you could kind of conceive of being nominated for a Best Picture Oscar, although it wasn't. But that's it's not like there's a bunch of movies that strike me as like being legitimate kind of contenders for an Oscar that are that great. Having said that, I do kind of like Crash. I think the backlash against it has been way over the top. The idea that it's this kind of, again, this another one of these kind of travesties is, I think, way over the top. It hasn't just been backlash. I mean, there was a lot of frontlash. People did not like it from the get-go. A lot of people didn't like it from the get-go. So it was not it's not like it was kind of widely beloved either. It was sort of there was a very vocal minority, at least, who really hated it from the get-go. But then the backlash against it has been even worse. So then a lot of people, I think, who probably liked it at the time or voted for it or whatever, came to like regret their vote or like be very less vocal about their appreciation of it. I think it's kind of, I like I say, I like it. I think it's kind of daring in terms of some of the content that it is presented, but it is, it is so schematic in the way it presents it that it's not, that it's not a great movie. It doesn't rise to the level of being great, partly because it's sort of not very sophisticated in the way it presents things. But I do think it's interesting in terms of trying some of the themes it's trying to address, and I think it is certainly like not a movie deserving of scorn, or some grave injustice has been done by it winning an Oscar. It seems pretty much in the mainstream of kind of movies that have won Oscars because of the themes they're dealing with, rather than any great artistic skill involved. So that's Crash. A movie that I do kind of get more, I guess get, and this maybe shows some of my biases. I get a little bit agree with the case against it of being like undeserved is Shakespeare in Love, and this is where I kind of, yeah, I'm more on the side of people saying this is like an undeserved Oscar and we should criticize it. And for one thing, I think people are, and again, correct my film history here, but this is one of the first examples of people showing that Harvey Weinstein was really playing politics and spending a lot of money to push through kind of a middle brow NPR book club friendly movie as this great movie. And then in retrospect, where, like I said, with it kind of makes sense to me. I can imagine a world where, it's very easy for me to get the thinking behind How Green Was My Valley over even Citizen Kane, or Going My Way over Double Indemnity. I think with Crash, it makes sense. Crash is the type of movie that Oscar usually goes for, so that it beat another type of movie that Oscars, uh, you know, sometimes go. The similar type of movie doesn't seem that notable. But for Shakespeare in Love to like beat The Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan, and you could say like, well, those two movies are too similar and the vote was split or whatever. And there's probably truth to that, but that's kind of crazy for Shakespeare in Love to beat those movies because they did get nominated, and those are both great movies. And then 1998 was actually a really strong year for movies in general, and much stronger than the year Crash won. And even if you stick just with movies of the kind that usually or might get nominated, or you can imagine being nominated, there's the Truman Show, which was nominated for Best Director but not for Best Picture, and that's 100 times the movie that Shakespeare in Love is. Alfonso Cuarón's movie of Great Expectations was not well loved at the time, but is a great movie, and certainly in the ballpark of the type of movies that get nominated. And then my favorite movie of that year, my choice for best movie of that year, is actually John Borman's movie The General, and is the type of movie that gets nominated. It isn't this sort of out there choice to think that The General might be nominated for an Academy Award. So there was a lot of great movies that you can imagine being nominated. And then moving out of that category, you've got the Last Days of Disco and Croupier and Out of Sight, and then The Big Lebowski, which is kind of ahead of its time. It took audiences a couple of years to really catch up with it. So it does seem that Shakespeare in Love is skating by on maybe the split vote between Thin Red Line and Saving Private Ryan, though that even got in the same pool with them suggests again like that story, that the Harvey Weinstein theory that he kind of pushed it through or paid for it to get through is pretty accurate. And I don't hate Shakespeare in Love. I don't think it's that great. Having said all that, and I agree, basically saying I agree with this idea that Shakespeare in Love doesn't deserve it. I think that it is close to a argument or a line of thinking that I would be wary of, which is this idea that I think it also suffers some backlash or some frontlash or backlash, because there's this idea or assumption that a Best Picture winner, something that's really Best Picture, needs to be kind of muscular and serious and high-minded. And so a romantic comedy, even like a literate one that's like, or like would be literate, or that's like aimed for like the, NPR literacy, NPR book club. So a kind of romantic comedy or comic movie or a lighter seeming movie is at a disadvantage. And I would not want to, I want to say like, I'm not ganging up on it because of that. I would be happy to support a romantic comedy as a Best Picture winner or nominee. I would happy to support just a comedy. I would be happy to support Dumb and Dumber 2 as the best movie of that year, which is, I'd be more than happy. But I do, and I do think that that tends to happen even in the better kind of lighter weight movies. Something like The Artist, I think, suffered a lot from that. It's this really enjoyable, entertaining movie. God forbid it win Best Picture over something sort of high-minded and serious. Even something like Sideways, which is dealing with a more serious topic, but is on a small scale and is comic, sometimes gets some backlash for, oh, this is supposed to be a great movie. It's just about some people, some dudes going around doing stuff, you know. So I would want to push back against this idea that a best picture needs to be a kind of, you know, muscular, high-minded, serious thing. So in some sense, I like that Shakespeare in Love at least won because it kind of bucks that trend. I just wish it was a better movie. I just don't think it's a good movie, unfortunately. Um, Another one I think sort of is undeserved again, Argo, the Ben Affleck movie. I know a lot of people kind of, I used to know a lot of people who liked it. When it came out, people seemed to like it. I think it's one of those movies that was refreshing for people to see at the time because it was like, oh, this is like a movie for grown-ups and it's made with some skill and it's kind of about a serious topic and it's old-fashioned in a way. But old-fashioned meaning like, you know, like the type of movies made for grown-ups in the 80s and 90s, not like old-fashioned like John Ford movies. Um, but you know, uh, in terms of being undeserved, that year just was like full of great movies. That is just, you look at Argo next to like The Master, or even you know, Resident Evil Retribution came out that year, or Moonrise Kingdom will complete our Anderson trifecta. You know, three dudes named Anderson each made a movie that's much better than Argo that year. Um, so I don't know. I feel that you know, Argo kind of skates by, or got there based on kind of nostalgia and the sense of it being a serious movie, but I don't think it's that great, and I think people have forgot. I think it's shown by like people. You don't have like Argo people coming around arguing about Argo. I don't know. There might be someone doing a podcast right now, kind of talking about how great Argo is, and it's a shame that people don't talk about it as much as they should. You're kind of a forgotten winner. Maybe someone's doing a forgotten winner thing about Argo right now. I don't know. Um, but I don't like picking on movies. I like to support movies, so I'll go back for my last couple to kind of argue against this undeserved, or at least not necessarily argue against it, but to provide a little more context. And in these cases, it's really comes down to like people being upset that one movie won out over another specific movie. So Forrest Gump, which beat the specific fan favorites of two different constituencies, sort of, which has some overlap, but it beat out Pulp Fiction and The Shawshank Redemption, both of which are, you know, have now huge fan bases, vocal fan bases. And, you know, of the three, arguably Forrest Gump has aged the most, both because it's sort of centered around this gimmick, and it even at the time, it almost by the time it was over, it had turned itself, you know, by the end of its running time, it turned itself into sort of a punchline. You know, we could think of it in today's terms as that it generated all these memes that ended up sort of undermining the seriousness of it. I think that led to people who were pro Forrest Gump when they saw it, kind of coming around to feeling just embarrassed by it, or thinking it was just a joke, and not seeing anything good in it. You know, I've I've always liked it from the get go. I've always liked it more than I like the Shawshank Redemption, which has virtues, but I think is sort of boring. I not don't like it as much as I like Pulp Fiction, but I don't think it's a world historical mistake that it beat Pulp Fiction for an Oscar. And I think it's kind of a cool Oscar winner. Again, if you take those movies out of it, it does have this kind of historical, high-minded, epic side to it, but that's leavened with a satirical strain and some really kind of great sequences. There's a debate about how serious that satire is, or how much we should, how much it counteracts the sentimentality and the high-mindedness. And I don't think it is. I don't think it's as coherent philosophically or politically as some of its most articulate supporters might have it. Like Dave Kerr's defense of it sees it really as a complete satire, and the satire, the sentimentality for him is meant satirically. I don't think that's quite the case, and I don't think that's how audiences responded to it. But I'm closer to that point of view, or I'm more sympathetic to that point of view than to the people who are just completely bashing Forrest Gump. And it's also just fascinating to see Zemeckis make this kind of gargantuan kind of version of a movie like Zelig, Woody Allen's Zelig. Although just mentioning Zelig makes me want to say, like, I think Zelig is actually a great movie, whereas Forrest Gump is has terrific sequences. I think it does have too many inconsistencies to really feel like a great movie. But it is great in moments, and so I'm okay with Forrest Gump winning. I don't think it's this huge injustice that it beat Pulp Fiction, even though I would, right today, probably rather watch Pulp Fiction. I think Pulp Fiction is the better movie, but I don't think it's a huge injustice. You know, Forrest Gump. Um, Another one again that gets bashed, I think for this one gets bashed, I think, because people genuinely kind of think it's a middlebrow thing, but it also for losing to a beloved movie, a movie beloved by egghead movie buffs, is The King's Speech, which beat The Social Network. And especially let's think now. It's like, oh, can you believe The Social Network didn't win the Oscar? Especially now, and everything's become digital, and The Social Network is obviously super important and the movie of our times, and it's embarrassing that the Oscar didn't go to it. And people thought that at the time too. People were like, oh, this is the movie of our times. I like a lot about The Social Network, and it's true that compared to The King's Speech seems like a safe NPR-ish choice. But I actually think, and it's more clear to me in retrospect, that the King's Speech is the more interesting movie. I don't think it's as well directed as The Social Network, and I don't think the screenplay is as technically proficient. I think Aaron Sorkin is just a great dramatist from a technical point of view, but I think Sorkin is a poor, kind of poor when it comes to kind of his thematic material, which I think is super conventional and just kind of very much the conventional wisdom. Whereas I think the King's Speech is actually more interesting thematically and less conventional than The Social Network. The Social Network gives us this kind of Sorkin version of Mark Zuckerberg, which isn't really like the real Mark Zuckerberg. And I don't care that it's inaccurate, and you can listen to my episode on historical inaccuracy about that. But but Sorkin seems to get all his ideas from movies, so he gives us kind of an easy movie answer to Zuckerberg's character that flatters our prejudices, rather than kind of wrestling with something more complicated. And the King's Speech actually does the opposite. It goes against the conventional wisdom of our era, which in a way says, it's a great virtue just to be yourself. You need to be yourself. And but the King's Speech is kind of saying, well, if you stutter and can't give a kind of speech that's going to inspire confidence, you can't be a good king. You actually you might need to better yourself in order to fulfill your responsibilities to the wider world, to society. And I think it gets away with that message because it is about a king, and but it's just not a conventional piece of wisdom you're going to get from most kind of NPR book club tier movies. So I'm always going to white knight for the King's Speech. I think it's underrated, and I think it has it brings forward thematic material that you don't get in other movies of the day. So this is already going on way too long, but I want to end with one last case where kind of combining a bunch of the things I've said already. So Dances with Wolves. So people point to Dances with Wolves and say this is a terrible winner because Goodfellas should have won. And I'm not going to argue with anyone who says Goodfellas should have won Best Picture. I'm not going to argue with anyone who says Goodfellas is the best movie of the 1990s. I am only here going to speak up for Dances with Wolves, which I think is a great movie in its own right. And I think, like Forrest Gump, people became embarrassed thinking back on it that they liked it. But not like Forrest Gump. I think it is actually a really great, coherent movie. And I think it's sort of unfortunate that it kind of had that backlash. I do think a lot of people at the time, you can go back and read. A lot of people at the time thought it was goofy right off the bat. There was frontlash against Dances with Wolves too, but I think its decline in reputation more has to do with people who liked it at the time, looking back and being suspicious of their enjoyment of it. And I sort of fit into that category because I loved it when it came out. I saw it when I was like 12 in the theaters, and I saw it twice, and I saw it again on home video. And then as I started to learn more about movies and become kind of a sophisticated movie fan, I realized that the sophisticated take on the movie was that this is a simple movie. It's goofy, it's dopey. And my film professor in college, Steve Weinberg, didn't like it. He had a big explanation for why it was bad. Pauline Kael has a very funny review about it, and she says it should have been called Plays with Camera, and she thought it was just kind of dopey and empty-headed with some pretty pictures. By the time I was out of college and into grad school, I think the widely held take on the movie was that it is a goofy movie. It's the butt of many jokes on the subject of dopey liberal message movies, and because of that, I didn't kind of go around saying like, actually, I really love Dances with Wolves. I thought, well, I'd seen it when I was 12. I was probably wrong. Um, what did I know? I'll just be quiet about it. On the other hand, though, I did like Kevin Costner's movie The Postman, and I really loved his movie Open Range. So in some senses, maybe I should have trusted my earlier sense that it was a good movie. I don't know. So I have watched it again recently, and this is another thing that spurred on this episode. Actually, I said it was just the conversation about how green was my valley, but it's also having seen Dances with Wolves again recently, and with 30 years of hindsight, you know, I don't think it fits into that category of liberal message movie at all, that both its detractors and its proponents kind of put it into at the time. And I think one of the difficulties of having a discussion about it now is people wanting to kind of put it back into like what it meant at the time. And we can't do that. We got to kind of look at it to a certain extent from how it appears as a movie right now. And so, you know, I think we can think of it I think there's better ways to think about it. One, it is like an old-fashioned uh, big romantic epic with this old Hollywood sensibility, kind of like Titanic, for example. But I think that's a good comparison because it's more offbeat than Titanic, and the first half especially has a streak of really absurd humor, and it doesn't really settle easily into something that I would consider a liberal message movie format. I think you have to ignore the nuances around the edges to make it fit. Um, it has this amazing sequence of the bison hunt right in the middle, which is just very powerful, and just because of this kind of great poetic, large-scale studio filmmaking. Is it goofy? Is it dopey? Does it have this dopey message? Well, it idealizes the Sioux, and that was really Pauline Kael's major slam against it, that it kind of idealizes them, it romanticizes them. My friend Steve Weinberg, he criticized it that it was just schematic. You've got the good white guy and then the bad white guy. You've got the good Indians and the bad Indians. Um, and on the one hand, I kind of want to argue just on the merits of that. Let's say it's true. Let's say their observations are true. Well, why shouldn't it idealize the Sioux? I mean, part of what movies can do, have always done, is give us these big romantic idealized myths, and especially westerns. Westerns have always kind of worked in that way of kind of idealizing some part of history and creating myths out of some part of history. So on just the straightforward thing, I think it's okay to do that to a certain extent. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, or there's anything particularly like bad about romanticizing and myth making in part of Hollywood. But I think it's actually. I think having said that, I think that they missed I think they're missing some of the subtleties and the nuance, which people do all the time in westerns. And this is something I haven't talked about on the podcast before, but I have made the point when I'm in some of my writing on movies, is that westerns often get looked down on for simplifying history, for romanticizing things, but they almost, not almost always, they often have this nuance that people are overlooking because they're just seeing the superficial. And I think that's also the case here. And, so for example, if I take kind of Steve's arguments, or kind of want to pick apart Steve's arguments, there aren't good and bad, American Indians in it. We are seeing things from the point of view of the Sioux, and the Pawnees are the enemy of the Sioux. But the movie makes it clear that that's not based in any like objective sense of the Pawnee being evil and the Sioux being good. It's more that they're in competition for the same resources, and the movie even makes that explicit, where Costner's character kind of wants to go on this raid with the Sioux against the Pawnee, and the Sioux, his friend, his buddy his buddy played by Graham Greene says, they aren't your enemies. You shouldn't go in this. You don't have. They're not. these aren't like bad guys. These are our enemies. That's not the same thing. So it's kind of made explicit about that. And that character played by the Pawnee character played by Wes Studi is given this kind of majesty and heroism, and shown to have this courage. So this idea that it's kind of very simplistic in that way, I think is wrong. And similarly, there's definitely bad white guys in it. They're certainly racist, which I think is fair to say that that's true. Um, uh, you know, but the point that they want, they're making it that they want to, they're writing against the Sioux because they say the Sioux have taken captives from settlers. That's true. And Kevin Costner's character says, though, no, the Sioux hasn't done that, but he's lying to them. He knows that they have. So their motivations are still kind of at least there. It isn't kind of this, they're just evil, or they're just driven by hate. They actually sort of have a grievance. And the movie overall, of course, is very anti-imperialistic and anti kind of anti-imperialistic for sure. So the overall point of view is kind of pro Sioux for sure. But at the same time, it isn't. I don't think it's as schematic as I don't think it simplifies as quite as easily. So for me, I think Dances with Wolves is a really great western. I think it is a great modern western, but unlike a lot of modern westerns, it is not clearly unconventional. It's not a clearly an anti-western. It's more in the line of these mythic John Ford films than it is in a movie that kind of tries to blow up the myth, like The Wild Bunch, or send it up like a joke, like in Little Big Man, or using the idiom of the western to do something that's really not western like The Shooting. It's in that sense it's kind of a square movie, despite its kind of liberal, or maybe because of, but it has this kind of hippie side to it, but it's still pretty square. And I think it is a great, like I say, a great western in that John Ford tradition. I don't think it's a bad Best Picture winner. I think again, it's actually one of the better ones. Looked at how, similar to how Green Was My Valley. Looked at it on its own, it's this really great winner, and looked at it on its own, it's one of the better movies to have won the Best Picture. And I think that the only reason, or not the only reason, but one of the reasons it comes under this criticism is because it goes up against Goodfellas, which is a great movie and is deserving of all the praise that is given to it, and also in some ways has kind of fits more into some of our contemporary values about what makes for great filmmaking than Dances with Wolves, which in a way is more, like I say, the end of a line of the John Ford style of things. So that's all I have to say for today. This is ended up being one of the longer episodes. It started out being something I thought would be much shorter, but that's sometimes what happens. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it kind of interesting, and I will hopefully talk to you again next week. Take care.